With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Yud Aleph. We left off all the way on the top of the Amid. We're going to be referring back to the case in the Mishnah, Daf Yud Amid Beis, regarding someone who designated the doves that were inside the pigeonhole prior to Yom Tov, but on Yom Tov you find them on the ledge in the front. Says the Mishnah that those pigeons are asurim. And here again, we're going to bring up that beautiful Rabbi Hanina that speaks about how are we to deal in a scenario where you have a roiv, and on the other hand, you have karoiv, you have conflicting values. Which one will trump? Says Rabbi Hanina, halech achar haroiv. Again, l'chu'ura, that's connected to the din in the Mishnah, and the Gemara, again, as we had in the previous year, will say that that's not necessarily the case. We're going to learn something very interesting simply about the nature of a dove. And if you remember, B'chlal, this whole sugya about taking a bird out of its chicken coop or out of a dove coat, for this not to include the violation of tzeidah, and we spoke out to Tosfos in the beginning of the sugya, we're speaking about young birds that are unable to properly fly. Nevertheless, they have the ability to hop. We're going to see about how far do they hop away from their nest. And no matter what the distance is, they won't even go the full distance if they are unable, while turning around, to see their pigeonhole. In other words, they go away as long as they are always able to turn around and to see from where they came from. We're going to have on Daf Yud Aleph the Mishnah that we already spoke out before in the Gemara, the Mishnah about the Eli, the Mishnah about the pestle that's normally used to grind grains. We learned the sugya kefi shitas Rashi. An Eli will be your classical keli or kli shemalachto le'iser. Question is, can you use it as a board upon which to chop meat on Yom Tov? We're going to have the topic of tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech in the context of that if you take something and prior to using it you change your mind, thus you won't use it, whether that will render you're taking it into a tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech or not. Actually, what I just mentioned for sure is called the tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech. The question is, do we have to be chayish? Do we have to have such a fear that such a thing might happen? We're going to have the sugya of that we permitted something to be done at the end, because if we won't permit it, then you might not do it to begin with, right? Like Ula speaks out that shloisha devarim hitiru soifan mishum tchilasan. The Gemara is then going to add a fourth halacha, which is also included in this hitiru soifan mishum tchilasan. We're going to have a ha'arama that will be permitted. As we already mentioned, the problem, the challenge, the prohibition of tanning hides on Yom Tov. The counter to that is that if you don't tan it at all, if you don't start working with the hide at all, it might get spoiled. And in that case, you might not shech the animal to begin with. What type of harama will be permitted? And ultimately, we're going to have the Mishnah Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis about a vendor being allowed to take off the shutter on Yom Tov, to put on the shutter his schayra, to put his merchandise, and then perhaps to be allowed to replace, to put back the shutter inside the booth, as was the way that vendors would behave in those days. And we're going to see that the shutters, some of them had two pivots, some of them had one pivot, some of them had no pivots. In other words, its replacement into the booth was more solid, was a little bit solid, was very flimsy. All of that will play into the question whether you may do that or not, and much, much more. Again, let us start on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Aleph. We are all the way on the top of the Amid, the two dots. The Gemara is referring back to the scenario where any non-domesticated bird, including doves, have a default status of muktzah. Even if you have a dove cote in your backyard, doesn't matter. They're non-domesticated. And you need to pre-designate them. So we had the machlokes, whether it has to be done by handling it, whether a verbal but specific designation suffices. And you made that. The problem is that the birds, the doves that you had inside the pigeonhole on Yom Tov are found umatzah lifnei hakein. They are in the ledge right in front of it. So the Mishnah paskins asurim. Why is it prohibited? Because we presume that the doves that were in the pigeonhole, they flew away. And the doves that you find now on the ledge, they came from out there. Okay, so says the Gemara, again, we had this in the last year, Lema Luchu'ura, should we say that this rule will be a shiur, will be something that Rabbi Chanina can lean on? What does Rabbi Chanina say? We know that generally there's the principle of roiv, of majority. There is another principle called karev, proximity. How are we to react if roiv and karev are conflicting one and the other? So Rabbi Chanina says, when you have to pick one over the other, halech achar haroiv, you follow majority. Majority is a stronger principle than the principle of proximity. And l'choira, that is mamish the basis for the din of our Mishnah. In other words, why are we saying that the pigeons that you find on the ledge are prohibited? Why would they be prohibited? Why don't we say that they came from the closest source? The closest source was from inside the pigeonhole. Inside the pigeonhole, the doves were muchand, they were prepared. And the answer is correct. Karev would lead you to that conclusion. But on the other hand, the majority of the pigeons, the majority of the doves, they are muktzah. So karev and roiv, halech achar roiv, that should be the rule. So says the Gemara, Amar Abaya, not necessarily so, because perhaps the Mishnah is only speaking about a case where the ledge that's in front of your pigeonhole is not a little narrow ledge, which is generally only going to be used by the pigeons from within the hole, but it's bedav. There's a proper large platform, and whenever you put a large platform on your shevach in front of a pigeonhole, not only do the pigeons that are inside the hole, the doves from inside the hole will make use of that daf, but all of the pigeons of the area will come and they will roost, they will hang out on the daf. So even if you will only look at what's more karev, I still will argue that pigeons from Alma were already sitting on the daf, and therefore these are the pigeons. So it's not one conflicting the other. Adarabah, you only look at karev together with roiv, and therefore the Mishnah says it's asurim. So says Abaya. Now the difficulty with Abaya is that the Mishnah didn't say that. Abaya is really limiting the scenario of the Mishnah. Normally you were to argue Rabbeinu HaKadosh should have said that. So Rava Omar, he doesn't like the daf, but he speaks about something that's a lot more common. Again, what Rava says is also not written explicitly in the Mishnah, but it was very common for people who have dove coats to have not one pigeonhole, but many of them. Whether they're going to have a little edge or a daf, that's already something not that common. Normally, you would have just a normal ledge. But Rava says that Bishnei Kinim Zula Mailam Mizu Askinan. The Mishnah is speaking about a scenario where you have two pigeonholes and dafka one above the other. And before Yom Tiv, the case is that you designated the pigeons or the doves that were only in one. When you come on Yom Tiv, what happens is, and there were pigeons in the other. And now when you come on Yom Tiv, both are empty. So it's not only that the ones that were pre-designated are empty, the other ones that are also near karev, they're also empty. And let's read it inside. There's no need to say that in the case where zimein batachtoina, that the pre-designated ones were in the lower pigeonhole, and you bechlal did not designate the pigeons or the doves that were in the one above, but Elyahu. Again, on Yom Tiv day, they are both empty. Now, on what ledge do you have now the pigeons? Only on the ledge of the bottom one. Here for sure, independent of Rab Chanina's rule, karev and roiv, halech achar roiv. Here, no, the ledge is near the bottom hole. The ledge is near the top one. They're both karev. Here for sure, we have to be machmer, we have to be stringent by saying the Omrin and Hanoch Azlula Alma, that the ones from the lower one, they flew away. For Hanoch, the ones that you find now on the ledge are from the upper pigeonhole. And why are they on the ledge of the lower one? Oh, that's very normal for pigeons, for doves to jump down. Ishtarvuv, right? V'nachos. They wandered out and they lowered themselves. That for sure we have to be suspicious for, and therefore paskin that they are asurin. Ella continues, Rava, even if the scenario was that the pre-muchand ones, the designated ones, were from the ones inside the above pigeonhole. And the pigeons that were before Yom Tov inside the lower one, you did not designate. They are the muksa ones. And now you come on Yom Tov, like we mentioned, and both pigeonholes themselves are empty. You find some doves on the ledge of the upper one, and there's nothing in the bottom one. Here also says Rava, that will be included in the case of the Mishnah. The ones on the ledge of the upper ones will also be prohibited, because we also say that Hanach Oslo La'alma. The ones that were muchan, the ones that were not muksa, the ones that were prior to Yom Tov in the upper pigeonhole, they flew away. Obviously, that pigeonhole is empty, but they completely went away. V'hanach, the first white line, and the ones that you find now on the ledge, really came from the bottom pigeonhole. Yeah, they jumped up. They climbed up the ledge, and because of that, the Mishnah says that the pigeons are asurin, and that might be even if we were not to agree with the principle of Rab Chanina. If we would have to choose between Roiv and Karoiv, even if we would choose Karoiv, still the Mishnah in this case would paskin that the pigeons are asurim. And now the two dots again, the two dots in the first white line. The Mishnah says that if you pre-designated pigeons inside the pigeonhole, and on Yom Tov it's empty, you find pigeons on the ledge. But if the im ein sham Eloheim, if there are no other doves in the entire vicinity, then they are mutarim. Then the ones that you found are mutar, because the only source was from the pigeonhole. Those were pre-designated, so you're good. So now the Gemara says, what do you mean there are no other doves in the entire vicinity? If we are referring to birds that can fly, then what do you mean there's no doves in the vicinity? Who cares? Doves that can fly are not bound to be coming from your vicinity. Why don't we say the ones that were muchand are no longer here? And the ones that you found, they came from out there. Who cares if they're not from the vicinity? Elot must be that we're speaking about the doves that you designated, the doves that you found are doves that are only able to hop. And again, like we mentioned, this has to be said from another angle anyways, because for you not to go into the challenge of tzeda, which may not be done on Yom Tov. So here's the rule. What's the vicinity? If there is another nest, another pigeonhole in which there are doves that are not muchan, that are muksa, and that's within 50 amos of from where you found it from your ledge, then indeed we do say that idude idadu, that maybe they hopped. Just laha'ir from everything we learned above. Here again you have roiv and karev. And if there isn't any other a pigeonhole within 50 amas, so then pshita demutarin. Then what's the novelty? The Amar Maruk v'Barchamo Kol Hamadada Ein Hamadada Yosem Chamishim Ama. Okay. So why do we need to have the Mishnah? Asks Toisvis, this is a very unusual kasha. The Mishnah is Atana. Marukva, who's the one that informs us that doves that are unable to fly it, the most that they hop is 50 amas. That's said by Mamar Ukva, that's said by an Amoira. You're telling me that a Mishnah is Pshita because we know a rule from an Amoira? We normally don't go in that direction, the top Toisvis. So he says that which Mar Ukva says is really to explain a Mishnah that we have in Bava Basra. So yeah, Mar Ukva gives the words, but it's really learned from another Mishnah. So we know it from another Mishnah back inside the Gemara. La'olam explains the Gemara, the Ika came b'soich hamisham ama. There is another a pigeonhole, dove coat within 50 amas. But, so indeed, why don't we say it came from there? Why don't we say it came from there? Ukegoin the kaima b'keren zavos. It's within 50 amas, but your dove coat is on one side of a building. Here you have in Rashi towards the bottom of the Amara picture. The one that's ma'alma, the one that has pigeons that are mutza, they are, let's say, 30 amas away, if you were to measure how many steps you are taking. but it's on the other side. It's on another side of a building. In other words, when you leave one pigeonhole, if you were to turn the corner to go to the other one, you would be unable to see the place where you came from. And Mao, the Tema you, therefore you would have thought, and like Man Ukva says, that up to 50 amas, doves will wander away. They'll hop away and then they'll come back. And therefore you would have to say that it's asurin. Kumash Milan, that's the chiddush of the Mishnah, that kol eichad medade. As long as it can hop, and every now and then the dove will turn around to make sure that it sees its home, that it sees its shoydish, that it sees from where it comes from. As long as it can see its shoydish, it's not afraid to go far within the 50 amas, but it can go away. But the Eloi, being that the case in the Mishnah is it's within 50 amas, but since it's around the corner, so there comes a point that it maybe only went 5 amas or 10 amas, it doesn't matter. But since it has to turn a corner, it won't turn the corner because it would be unable to see its source. And therefore, we can say that the doves that you found are the doves from your dove coat, from your pigeonhole, the ones that are muchan, and therefore the Mishnah says they are mutarim. How beautiful is that? Applying it to us, we're called doves, the Jewish people. That's the whole echt of a ashuv. So the challenge that we have to make sure that we don't make a mistake is because we know that we can always turn around and we can come back to our source. And we have to make sure that that doesn't justify us hopping away too far, God forbid. Again, just to point out that this whole concept, to a certain degree, does challenge the whole Gemara above. Because if we're trying to say that our Mishnah is not a siyua to Rabbi Chanina, well, here doesn't appear to be that way. Because if it's, even though it's within 50 amas, even though it's within, I take that back because what we are saying is that the pigeons that you found on the ledge were here before, perhaps. They were here before. It's still called karev. It's still called karev. That's the way you must say. As long as it's within 50 amas, it's not roiv versus karev. It's karev. Okay, says the Mishnah. The beautiful thing is that we had all of these Mishnayos and above, and therefore it's helpful when we hear it again to better get it the second time. So here's the source. An Eli is a pestle that normally is used to grind kernels. And as we mentioned, even though that food-related activities are generally permitted to be done on Yom Tov, but when it comes to preparing bread, that's only from kneading onwards. And any other activity that even if you would have done it before Yom Tov would not have made the food less fresh, like whether you're going to crush the kernels into flour today or yesterday or tomorrow, it won't make the flour and the bread and the pastries more or less fresh, then you have to do it prior to Yom Tov. So therefore, we're viewing the Eli as a keli that is designated for something that's prohibited to be done on Yom Tov. So learns Rashi. Now, if you want to use it, let's say gufay, you're using it for a permitted activity. You have meat and you need a chopping board. Can you chop meat on this Eli? So Beishamai says no, and Beis Hillel says yes. Now, just to point out that we are learning Gemara Rashi, the second Tosfos in the Amid wants to make it clear that it's not enough for you to say that this Eli is in the category of a Keli Shemalach Iser, because then Beis Shammai would not prohibit it. Even Beis Shammai will admit that you are allowed to use it, l'tzoyrech gufay. And therefore, Tosfos adds a nuance that since this Eli is something that ordinarily the owner would not allow to use for any other purpose, that's called muksa, machmas chesron kis or machmas chisaron kis, which is a higher category of muksa. The owner is concerned that if he'll use this pestle for other items, for other works, for other activities, it's going to ruin it, and it's something of great value. That is even worse. And that's why Beis Shammai says you may not do it. That's very important. That means according to Tosfos, even muksa, machmas chesron kis, Beis Hillel will be matir. Anyways, we're coming back. We're learning Shitas Rashi, Dafka. This is really a machlokes in the Gemara. How to understand the Eli, that this is only a Keli Shemalach Iser, and that's the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Again, Beis Hillel is going to be the lenient opinion. That's the normal Beis Hillel, and we paskin like Beis Hillel that you could use it l'tzoyrech gufay. Now, next case. Weiter. Beishama Yomim, you shecht an animal on Yom Tov, which you may. You have the hide that normally you would begin at least the tanning process on the day that you slaughter it to make sure the hide will not start to spoil. And you may not tan the hide midoiraisa, but if you were to put it in a public area, in a place where many people are walking back and forth, and people that will be walking on the hide won't be aware of the fact that what they are doing is beginning to tan it. It's not their intent. They don't even know it's there. That would be something that at worst would be prohibited midrabanan. So why would we allow something that normally is prohibited rabbinically? Because if you won't be allowed to begin the tanning process, we are afraid that you won't shech the animal to begin with. So you may not place the animal hide where it will be trampled upon. And not only that, it's not only about the problem of beginning of ma'abed, that's the meaning of tanning, but b'chlal it's muktzah. You may not even lift it. If there is a kazayas of meat, can be raw meat, doesn't matter. But you are allowed to take now this raw meat to prepare it for Yom Tov. So that will justify you moving the entire hide. If you don't even have a kazayas of meat, then it's muktzah to begin with. And Beisilo are matirin on both. Why is it not muktzah? Because they allow you on Yom Tov to put it in front of people for it to be trampled upon. That in itself takes it away from its muktzah status. That means you are allowed to begin the procedure of tanning it, which normally would have been a rabbinic violation because of Simchas Yom Tov. Okay, the Gemara is going to begin first on the first case of the Mishnah, which is the case of the Eli, the case of the pestle. So Tana, we learned in a Beitzah that the Shavin, both Beisil and Beishamai will agree that She'im Katzav Olav Basar, that once you already used it to chop meat on it, that now she'asr l'taltaloi, you may not move it. And now we're speaking about moving it. This is called l'tzoyrach atzmai. Let's say it's right now in a location where, let's say, the sun is beating down, and you don't want the sun to completely dry out, or somehow it's going to ruin that heat is going to degrade the quality of the Eli. Moving an item that's normally designated for something that may not be done on Yom Tov for itself, that's something that you may not do. That's bein lebeishamai ubein lebeisil. Okay, Amar Abaye says Abaye that machloikes in our Mishnah is only be'eli, a pestle that is normally used to crush grain. Aval bitavra garme, but a butcher's board, a board that a butcher uses to chop meat, l'divrei hakol muter, everyone will hold that it's not mutza. Says the Gemara, of course, pshita. Eli tanan. Says the Gemara, no. Let me explain to you what Abai is really trying to allude to. One might have thought that that one may not even use a butcher's board. Now, what will be the issue of using a butcher's board? It's not only not a chesron kiss, it's not even a keli shemalachta le'isr. So here we are introducing, like we spoke in our intro, the concept of tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech. If you pick something up and you might change your mind using it. Now, why would you change your mind using it? I'll explain that in a moment. Then sometimes Chazal will say, don't pick it up to begin with. If you'll use it, then you're good. But if you pick something up and then you will change your mind, it will turn out retroactively that you exerted yourself unnecessarily so. Tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech. A butcher's board is normally used by a butcher. It was not the type of board that you use in your kitchen. So you're borrowing something to use it. You might change your mind. Okay. So really, the Abai says there's a chiddush. One might have used the concept of the Mishnah even to this kavara of garmi. For the Tani Eli, one would have thought that the reason why the Mishnah speaks about the pestle is that not only are we not concerned about a tirchat shaloi l'tzoyrech, but even more, we're not concerned. That's why the Mishnah said Eli. But really, you have to add that Lebeishamai, it's not only about muksa, but we are also concerned that tircha shaloi l'tzoyrech. Now, the challenge with this first version is that why would we be concerned that someone would change his or her mind using a butcher's board. Why? It's so similar. I know the butcher chops in it much larger pieces of meat. Maybe it's used commercially. You're using it in your kitchen, but it's more or less the same thing. You want to cut meat on it. The chances for you to change your mind is very little. So that's why the other version, Ikada Amri, Amar Abaya, this was the nuance that we have to add. If you have a brand new butcher's board, any brand new keli, you have that feeling, oh my God, if the moment you use it the first time, you already get it filled with fats and you're already, it gets dirtied. Now, if it would be made to have your kitchen's cutting board, of course you would use it. But this is a butcher's board. So here you're changing its function a little bit from it being used, let's say commercially, for you using it in your private kitchen, and it's brand new. So here there's a little bit of a chance. One might have thought you can't take it because you might pick it up and say, oh my God, I'm not going to use this. I'll find something different. Why should I take away its newness? And here again, Mao, the
Rabbi,
yes.
I don't understand something. Do we ever, in the concept of muksa, have this idea that a klisha mlachtin leheter can't be moved because you're afraid of tirchi etzera?
We're not talking about muksa. We're not talking about muksa. We're talking about mimlach v'loy tavar. Mimlach means that you pick something up, something that's significant, and you might end up not using it. It's going to come out that you exerted yourself.
I understand, but I'm saying anytime you pick up a klisha mlachtin leheter without using it, you could say that you exerted yourself.
Why would you pick it up if you're not going to use it? It's very rare for that to happen. Whenever you make substitutions, that way you would say it. When you're taking what you need, you don't find. You're taking something else that can also serve your need. Yes, that's the topic. Something else that can also serve your need, you might change your mind. And we might have thought that we would say Mimlach v'loy tavar Allah because it's brand new, Kumash Malan, that you are allowed to use it. That you are, so I'm sorry. So Abai is, at least there's a chiddush, Danny. In other words, what Abai is saying is that even Beis Shammai doesn't have that suspicion. Hello, Danny, that answers your question. But there's a novelty in that. Says the Gemara, is that true? Beis Shammai doesn't have such a suspicion. He doesn't take that into account. Beis Shammai, listen to this. Here will be your case. If you have a shoichet with a knife, the ikar is about the knife here, and you want to transport it to the animal on Yom Tov, you are allowed to shecht on Yom Tov. So says Beis Shammai that if the animal is not near the shoichet, it might be that after all of that walk, you might change your mind, which is what happens. Then lachatchila, you can't walk the knife to you, you can't go there. Because if you won't end up shechting, it came out that you made an act of hoitzah, you transported something, and similarly, you can't schlep the behema near the tabach, the sakin. Clear. Beis Hillel says we don't have to take that possibility into account. Furthermore, the Beitzah continues. You are not allowed to transport spices and a pestle to a mortar. Even though we're speaking about spices now, guys, spices, unlike grains, may be crushed on Yom Tov because spices will have more sharpness if you just freshly ground it up. So I'm allowed to do the act of grinding it. The question is, can I transport here the spices and the pestle to the mortar? Says Beis Shammai, you may not. Or in the other direction, you may not transport the medoicha, the mortar, to the tavlin and the madich, to the spices and the pestle. Beis Hillel says, you don't have to be afraid that you're gonna change your mind. Bottom line is that we see that Beis Shammai does have this chayshinon dilma mimlach. So how can Abaye say that everyone in the Mishnah agrees that by a tavara garmei chadato you are allowed to use it, even Beis Shammai l'chayda not? Answers the Gemara, hachi ashtam bishleim behemam. Maybe taka you'll change your mind. Why would you change your mind? Because the Amad, the owner, will say nishbak. Nishbak is an interest. I'll leave this. I'm not going to take this animal. You know why? Mamish, like the case of the pigeons, like the doves. Why do you have to pre-designate it? because you might change your mind, right? The Beis Shammai says you have to handle it because when you come near the animal, you might discover the animal is too lean. I want something even better. But when it comes to cooking a dish, it's possible that when you actually come to the dish, you might say, I'm not going to go ahead and crush spices. The whole dish, I'm not going to exert any effort for this dish because because it needs to have spices, which means it's blah without it. No, I'm going to bring another. I'm going to begin working on a whole different dish that doesn't even need spices. But over here, what's the case of the Mishnah? The case of the Mishnah is you want to chop up meat that was already slaughtered. What options do you have? That you're going to change your mind. No, even the shachta, since you already slaughtered the animal, that's the case. Then the tefilla kaimer, it stands to be cut up. There's no reason for you not to end up doing what you're doing. Now, again, there's the chiddush is that you would have thought that it's a brand new board. Doesn't matter. It's made to cut meat upon it. That you're not going to change your mind. And the whole issue in the Mishnah, again, Lashitas Rashi, is Kelish Malachta Isa. This is a pestle. The pestle is made to crush grains. Crushing grains is not something that you can do on Yom Tov. You are changing its purpose. Kelish Malachta Isa, Beis Shammai holds, may not be moved. L'tzoyrech gufay. And according to Tosfos, Beis Shammai holds that a keli that has in it chesron kis may not be used. Next case in the Mishnah regarding placing the animal's hide, where it will be trampled upon. Beis Shammai is machmer, you may not do it, thus rendering the hide muktzah unless it has substantial, meaning kazayis meat on it. Beis Hillel says you are allowed to do it. Beis Shammai, Tana, we learned in a Beitzah of Vishavin. Both Beis Shammai and certainly Beis Hillel agree that when you are about to roast meat, and we learned this in Chulin, so yes, we have to get rid of the blood. If you're going to cook meat, then the process of salting is a lot greater, right? There's the rinsing, and then there's the salting, and there's a lot of salt, and then you have the soaking in the water. So this amount of salt used for cooking is a lot of salt. When you roast it, since fire draws out the blood, you need much less salt, and indeed, until today. Now, when I salt meat, some of the salt that I'm throwing on the meat will fall to that which is underneath it. There is even Beis Shammai, the hide is muktzah, but yet he's moida that you can take meat that you are about to roast, and therefore you're salting it, salted on top of the hide. Now, salt is one of the items that also initiates the tanning process. That is completely permissible. That says in a Beitzah. Amar Abaya adds Abaya on the Beitzah. Lo shanu, only the small amount. Ela l'tzli. But if you're going to be salting meat to cook, which you are allowed to do on Yom Tov, but there you're using large amounts of salts, then no, you may not do it. Hold on, the Gemara says, who needed the Abaya to say that? Pshita, the Beitzah says, litzli tanan. So Kamash Malan, dafilu litzli ke'en kedera also, that if you are roasting it, and you're using this, what we call as a ha'arama, you're like tricking the system. Person will say, I'm roasting it. I'm going to add more salt for roasting it. That you may not do. You only can salt the meat prior to roasting if the amount of salt is the amount that's needed and not more than what's needed. Making sure that the quantity of salt that will fall off the meat onto the hide is minimal, then we are not afraid that you might end up directly salting it. That's the fear here. That's ma'amed. That's already allowed. And the upside of that will be is that, again, first of all, we're not saying that the hide will always be spoiled. But if it's very hot and you did nothing, it might get spoiled. And this is something that will delay the spoiling process. And even Beis Shammai, making the owner more comfortable to shech the animal on Yom Tov without the fear it's not worth it. The hide will spoil, and I'm gonna roast it and I'll salt on top of it. It's not as good as placing it out there for people to trample upon, but it's somewhat of a solution. Tana Rabbanan says the Gemara, we learned in a Beitzah, Ein moilchen es hachalav. So Rashi writes here 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Here also, when you shech a behema, not a chayah, but a behema. So that which the Torah calls chelev, not what we call fat. You have to know the halachic fats of a behema is prohibited to eat under the penalty of kares. On the other hand, you can make use of that chelev. It's muter bahanoah. Here again, the chelev of a behema, if it's not salted, very similar to the process of tanning hides, that type of process should be done to the chelev if you don't want it to ruin. Here again, we're speaking about an animal that you shechted on Yom Tov as you may, yet, says the Beitzah, you may not salt it. You can't begin the process. That's called ma'abed. Not only that, you can't even start turning it over from one side to the other, because normally when people would start turning the fats from one side to the other, that was prep for the salting, that was prep for the tanning of the fats. Tanning of the fats is prohibited biblically, so don't even start turning it over from one side to the other. However, Mishum Rabbi Yeshua Amru, that shoitchan baruach al gabe yisedus. If you have pegs, and they would sometimes stretch these fats on pegs, you are doing it because you want a lot of wind. You want it to be exposed to more wind to prevent it from spoiling. That's something that you are allowed to do. 1 second. How is that different than salting? So we'll see in a moment that if people would sometimes sit on it, or they would use these fats as a mat. So what you're doing is you are preparing it, so to say, to do something with it that you are allowed to do on Yom Tov. That's permitted. And here we're not going to say, but you might end up salting it. You won't. Amarav Masna. I want you to know that the halach is like Rabbi Yeshua. That's version number 1. Version number 2 is Ikeda Amri Amarav Masna Ein halach Ikeda Rabbi Yeshua. Asks the Gemara, hold on. We needed the Rav Masna to say that. It's without Rav Masna, I would have said Yachid v'Rabim halacha kerabim. We follow the majority. Here it's Rabbi Yehoshua. Obviously, the Tanakh does not even allow you to spread it over on pegs. So there's a chiddush by telling you halacha kiyachid. Right? Second to last line. Navros then. Allah is like the Chachamim. Pshita yachad v'Rabim halacha kerabim. Answers the Gemara. There is still a need because now the Taimah Mistaber time of Rabbi Yeshua. Why is that? Why are we looking for these a way out? We're looking for a heter because the Eloi shot is slave. You won't find a way that you will be allowed to prevent these fats from getting spoiled. Mimna v'lo shachat. You might not end up slaughtering the animal to begin with, and therefore you will lack in simchas Yom Tov. Komash Malan, that you are allowed to spread it on pegs. You are allowed to spread it on pegs. Now, asks the Gemara, we pass like Beis Hillel allows you to put the hide in an area upon which it will be trampled upon. Mamish. So why over here is Beis Hillel a lot more restrictive? You can't even turn it over. I know it's not Beis Hillel, but that's the Mishnah's psak. Answers the Gemara Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis Hassan. When it comes to spreading the hide, Beis Hillel is more lenient. You're not doing it for tanning, right? Why is that? Because Mishum the Chazi lemizga alei. The hide is something that people sometimes use as a mat, even if no tanning was done to it at all. So that's why it doesn't look as bad. So you're putting it out there. Because maybe someone wants to sit right over there instead of sitting on the mud, they'll sit on the hide. But hachi over here, when it comes to the spreading of the fats, they'll say that if I have a way of somehow making some use of it, right? Especially let's go with ein halacha k'Rabbi Yeshua, I can't even spread it on pegs. If we wouldn't say that, if we would allow you to spread it on the pegs, I would say, why am I allowed to do it? In order for it not to get spoiled, they took that into account. So mali lemishtachinu, mali lemim lechinu. If they allowed me to spread it on pegs, maybe they allowed me at least to put some salt on it. So kamash malan, that what? And that's why even lebeis Hillel, there's no such permit. We're looking for other solutions of beginning a salting process. Says Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Moilech Adam Kama Chatichos Basa B'Basachas. Salting, not only is salting fats a preservative, But even meat without refrigeration, when meat is salted, it's going to last a lot longer prior to it getting spoiled. What happens if you shecht an animal on Yom Tov? Now, shechting on Yom Tov is permitted. Salting those parts of the meat that you will eat on Yom Tov is permitted. What happens to the other parts of meat that you don't plan to eat today? Then that will be something that you would not be allowed to do anything with. The problem is it's going to get spoiled. So here is a way out, that if the amount of salt that you need for the meat that you will eat today, you have to put a handful of salt. If that amount of salt is good for one piece, it's good for two pieces. By you putting the two pieces together, you're not doing anything in addition. Then you can take the salt and throw it on two pieces. That you could salt various pieces of meat as long as you're doing it bebas achas. You're doing it in a single act of salting. Again, we're trying to find a way out where you're not going to be violating preparing for the weekday, and you're not going to be violating working on Yom Tov, and that will be the way out. Now, the Ahava has a better solution. What happens if you have a large behemoth? And no, if you want to salt all of the meat, one single act of salting won't be enough to cover everything. So what should you do? So he gives a gavaldik solution. That's called a ha'arama. You're tricking the system. Take a piece of meat. Let's say on Yom Tov, you're going to have 10 ounces of meat. Good. Take 10 ounces of meat and you can salt it. Then you are allowed to say, you know what? I don't want this piece. I'm going to have another piece. Then you take another piece. Weiter, you salt it. And you go through the whole animal. In other words, every time you salted the meat, your intent is, this is the one I'm eating today. Verstehst? That's a way to trick the system. You should do an act of harama, and you should salt one piece, and then another piece, and then another piece. And every time you finish salting it, change your mind. Say, not this one, I'm going to go to another one. That's a rus. That's a harama. And that's permitted, all because of Simchas Yom Tov, because we don't want for people to hesitate slaughtering an animal by saying, listen, I can only do certain things only for that which is needed for today. All of the rest, I can't do anything with. It's going to get ruined. It's a big expense. You know what? I'm not going to have meat for Simchas Yom Tov. Whenever we could, we figure out ways for the person to know that they won't lose the rest of the animal. Moving on to the next Mishnah. Says the Mishnah,
ridiculous rules where, I mean, does it make sense, Rabbi? Tricking the system. Sorry, Rabbi. Okay, go on.
Says the Mishnah, like we spoke out before, vendors would many times store their merchandise in these booths that were not mamish real estate. They were movable booths. Things in there were secured because there was like a trisen, there was some sort of shutter that, that blocked, that this allowed people from just going into these booths. When vendors would properly open up the shops, not only would they remove the shutters, but they would use these shutters as trays upon which to display their merchandise. Says Be'en on Yom Tov again to speak out, and again we'll get to more details later, that one is allowed to purchase items on Yom Tov, items that are needed for Yom Tov with many conditions. You can't count a specific amount. You can't speak money. So you go into a store. So normally this only works when the seller and the buyer know each other and trust each other. So let's say I ran out of water today. So you go into a shop and you take a box of Perrier, you take a box of water, and after Yom Tov, you go over and you tell them, I took a box, and then you make up and you pay them. So that action of taking the box is permitted. Question is, can you remove the shutters? The Shammai says, now, what would be the issue? The way we learned this Gemara is that there is a prohibition of demolishing and of building, soiser and boina, and Beishamai holds that the problem, the malacha of soiser does not allow you to remove the shutters. Beisilo not only allow you to remove it, but even after the sale was done, you can even replace it. Now, if, as we'll develop the sugya, if according to Basilo, like we spoke out above, ein binyan, the ein stira b'kelim, is azas strong halacha, that it's completely a non-issue, still you can argue, there's a why are you putting the shutter back? you're putting the shutter back for people not to be able to steal merchandise. And as we'll speak out, that even if you were to view this as a non-Yom Tov need for people not to steal your merchandise, if the vendor would not be allowed to put the shutter back, he would not sell merchandise to begin with. And this will be one of the many cases where Chazal permitted something to be done at the end, which would be to replace the shutters, because they knew that if they won't permit that, you will not to begin with sell merchandise. There'll be a lack of food that's needed for Yom Tov. There'll be a lack of Simchas Yom Tov. So Beisilol Matiden Aflahachser. Says the Gemara, first of all, my Tirisin means what type of Tirisin? What type of shutters? Amar Ula, we're dafka speaking about Tirisi Chanuyas, shutters of vendor stalls, meaning that they're not attached to the ground. If these are buildings that are attached to the ground, then absolutely Beisilol wouldn't be that lenient. That will go into the problem of binyan or of stira. For Amar Ula, now that we clarified that there's no biblical issue here, but there might be a problem, but the counter is Simchas Yom Tov, which is why you are allowed to remove it to sell it. Now we want to understand why does Beisilol even allow you to replace it. For Amarula, that there are three halachas where we say this principle that we permit the end, we permit the final phase in order for you to do it to begin with. If we would leave the final step prohibited, and theoretically it should be prohibited, you might not do what you are allowed to do, and in our case, you won't sell anything, and there'll be a lack of Simchas Yom Tov. And what are the three Devarim? The Elohein, and we had all of them. We have two of them here, and then we'll learn a third one. Number one is the Elohein Oir Lefnei Hadorson. The fact that Beisilol allows you to spread the hide, even though we learned on top of the Amid that, sometimes people would spread the hide out for people to use it as a mat, it's a stretch. They only allowed for you to do that, and not saying that you might end up doing ma'abed or there's no ma'abed midrabanan, because if you won't be allowed to do it, you're not going to shech the animal. Number two is our Mishnah. The fact that Beisilol allows you lahachzir to put back these shutters, trisei chanuyos, that's because of this rule of hitiru seifan mishum tchilasan. And number three, b'chazaras l'tiyah b'migdash. Chazaras l'tiyah b'migdash means to replace the dressing on a wound by a kohen in the Beis HaMikdash. A kohen that's doing the avodah may not have anything that interposes between his hand and the holy item that he's using in the service of Hashem. If he has a wound and he has a bandage, so during the avodah he has to remove the bandage. The only problem is that he's not concerned about the removing of the bandage for the few minutes of the avodah. What the kohen will be concerned is that if he won't be allowed to replace the bandage, and normally you may not bandage yourself on Shabbos. Or why? Because of the fear that the Chachamim had that if you're going to take medicine, or in our case, if you're going to dress a wound, you might end up shchikas samamanim. You might end up grinding the various herbs to make that into the ointment that you need or the medicine that you need. So to be far away from making medicines on Shabbos, you may not take medicines, including you may not dress a wound. That rabbinic decree was let go in the Beis HaMikdash. A kohen is allowed to redress his wound. And why is that? Because if they would not have been mated dressing a wound by a kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, then knowing that there's a chatzitza, not wanting for his wound to get infected, whether they use those words then or not is irrelevant, he's not going to do the avodah. He's not going to do the avodah. I don't want to get into a problem. I want to make sure that I heal properly. So they allowed you, therefore, the soifan to redress the wound. B'meila, you won't hesitate and you'll take off the bandage, knowing now there won't be a chatzitza, and you'll do the avodah. These are the three cases. Rachva says in the name of Rebbe Yehuda, beautiful Rashi here, that this Rebbe Yehuda, the teacher of Rachva, was also an Amoira. Normally, Amoirayim from Bavel did not have the real smicha, so normally they're not called the Rebbe, they're called the Rav. However, since Rashi writes over here, V'nira be'enai, that the Rabbi Muvak of Rachava was Rav Yehuda, we should all call our Rabbi Muvak Rebbe. Call the Rebbe, Hostel. Oh, very nice. So Rachava says the name of his teacher, Rebbe Yehuda. I have a fourth case. So what dinam are we talking about? So in Masechtas Chagig on the third chapter, we go from the most esoteric Gemara, Maise Bereshis, Maise MERCAVA, In the second chapter, we jump into that, into all of the dinim of Tum and Tara on the third chapter. And one of the things we learn is like this, that when people in Bisman Bayesheni were called Amaratzim, non-Chaverim, people that were not that learned, and therefore they were not that careful in the laws of Tum and Tara, they normally were presumed midrabanan to be tummy. Therefore, things that they touched, food items that they touched, also by default becomes rabbinically impure. But during the Yom Tovim, there is no takana. The Chachamim did not place this rabbinic tuma on Amaratzim. Why is that? Because it's normal that on Yom Tov, right, in Yerushalayim, you have people that are selling wine. They would have big barrels. All of the buyers, all of the clients would come with their receptacles. They would stick it into the barrel to take to buy their bottle of wine, and they would touch the wine, they would touch the dough. And you're kidding, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to impose this, and Ama'aretz touched it, it's tummy. So during Yom Tov, Chazal said, even an Ama'aretz has the status of Tahara. Okay, question is, how do we view those food items, the barrel of wine, the dough, that was handled during Yom Tov by Amaratzim? Does it now, after Yom Tov, you would say, okay, during Yom Tov, we gave it the status of Tahara, but now let's call it Tameh. So actually, we have there a machlokas tanoim, and says Rachava that he's paskening not like the Chachamim, but yes, like the Tana Rebbe Yehuda, that holds that since Chazal took away the status of Tumas Ha'Ma'aretz during Yom Tov, we extend it to after Yom Tov. Not if they touch something after Yom Tov, no. But we can't say after Yom Tov that now that it's after Yom Tov, you know that an Ha'Ma'aretz touched it during Yom Tov. Now we got to treat it like it's tummy. They don't say that either. If you already opened up your barrel on Yom Tov, if you already started selling a dough and everyone took a part of it, al gavaregel, that now we say that after Yom Tov it continues tahar. This obviously is only following the sheet of Rebbe Yehuda, the Amar, that says that we are allowed to finish that product after Yom Tov in the state of tahara. Why is that? Because of Mishum Tchilasan. Because Rebbe Yehuda holds that if Chazal would only say on Yom Tov, treat it as if it's tahar. But after Yom Tov, we're going to say retroactively, now we got to really say the emes. The guy touched it, he was probably tamei. You will hesitate and not sell wine during Yom Tov. Certainly not the way Ha'Ma'aretz. So to prevent the soifan from happening, they were matim. Says the Gemara, the whole rest of the Amud, almost the rest of the Amud, is going to be one simple question. Why did I need to have Ula? Why did I need to have Rachava? These are all Tanoim. We know all this. So why did I have to have Ula? That tell me that that this is Hitiru Soifa Mishum Tchilasa Nechvashtenish Tanina. It's a Beferish Mishnah. Answers the Gemara, no. Without Ula, I would have thought that the reason why Beis Hillel allows you to place a hide in front of people that will trample upon it is because since the Chazi Lemizga Alayu, like we learned on top of the Amit, since some people would use the hide to use as a mat. And therefore, this is very important. And if we can always view it that way, even if the animal would have been slaughtered out of Yom Tov, Beis Hillel would have allowed for you to spread out the hide on the public domain, even though you know that people will trample on it, but still, no problem. I'm doing it for a mat. Nami. So all it wants to tell you, Kumash Malan, that the only reason why Beis Hillel allows you to spread it out, even with the Chazi Lemizga Alei, is only because of Itiru Sefer Mishum Tchilasan. It's only because Beis Hillel understood that you might not slaughter it today if you don't have a solution. But no, it's the Yom Tov in. But if the animal was slaughtered out of Yom Tov, and for some reason you lazy one did not, or you had no time, whatever the reason is, you did not begin the tanning process, you may not do it even according to Beis Hillel. Because here we do argue, you're kidding, people are going to trample upon it. It's a ma'abed, it's definitely a ma'abed d'Rabbanan. You may not do it. Beautiful. Likewise, the second din of Ula was today say Chanuya Islami. Why did I need Ula? Tanina, we learned in our Mishnah that Beis Hillel natin nafil Ula achzer. Again, answers the Gemara. Without Ula, I would have thought Kamayu the Beis Hillel is only because he subscribes to the rule that ain't binyan bekalim, the ain't stira bekalim. And therefore, even on a rabbinic level, there's mamish no problem with you placing back the shutters. And therefore, what? Ba'afilu debatim. Let's go with the sheet of Daran. What happens if these stalls, if these booths are inside your house. And therefore, even if you will not replace the shutter, you won't have any fear that people are going to steal from it, because no one has access to it unless you give them access by opening up the door in your house. So if it's mamish not a problem, then even if these shutters, even if these stores are in your house, Beis Hillel would allow you to do it. It says, oh, no. There is normally this would have been a problem. Here we are being mated. We need a heter. Kamash Malan, that it's only Hitiru Sefer Mishum Tchilasan. So therefore, the Chanuya is in. If these are vendor stalls that are out in the public domain, and if you won't be allowed to put the shutter back, people might steal from it, and therefore the vendor will hesitate, might not sell. That's when Beis Hillel was mater. But if they are in a secure area, so explains the Ran, then loy, there is no such a heter. And now the third one, guys, the first white line. Again, the third case of Ula was Chazoras Ritia Bamigdash, that a kohen is allowed to replace his dressing on a wound on Yom Tif, right? On Shabbos or Yom Tif, it goes on both. Why do I need Ula Nami Tanina? Guys, we learned this a Mishnah in Eruvin that Machzirim Ritia Bamigdash, Avaloy B'Medina. Medina means outside of Beis Hamikdash because of the rabbinic prohibition of making use of medicine. So says the Gemara, I still need to have Ula because Mal the Tema, guys, here we go. Where's Tzvika? Ein Shvuz V'Migdash. That's the whole end of Eruv. Ein Shvuz V'Migdash might lead someone to say that even if the kohen is not doing the avodah, maybe we'll apply Ein Shvuz V'Migdash for non-avodah activities. Mishum Ein Shvuz V'Migdash. And therefore, I feel a kohen, the lav bar avodah, who also will be allowed to replace a dressing on the wound. So Kamash Malan, no, that this heter Ein Shvuz B'Migdash would not apply here. One of the reasons is because Ein Shvuz B'Migdash is only avodah related, and therefore you need to have the reason of Hitiru Sefer Mishum Tchilasan. So only a kohen that is potentially able to do the avodah, him not being allowed to dress his wound will prevent him from doing the avodah to begin with. That's why we're mated it. So the heter is only the bar avodah in. But if a kohen, for whatever reason, is not going to be doing the avodah, he has no such heter. Even in the Beis Hamikdash, you may not dress a wound on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, because you might end up making the ointment violating an Isur D'Oraisa. Okay, now we had Rachav, who gave a fourth case. So Pesach es Chavisoi Nami, did we not learn this in Mishnah and Chagiga, that a Pesach es Chavisoi, or if you already began to have customers take from your dough, al gav horegel, not only for sure, on the Yom Tov, we view these items to be tohar, we don't apply the rabbinic tumas amaratzim, but it extends after Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda says you can finish it after Yom Tov, Chachamim say lo yigmar. So isn't that also clear that it's soifa mishum tchilasan? Why do I need to have him to add this? So Mao the Tema know that tumas amaretz beregel kitara shavirabanim. And if, in other words, is it chutra or the chuya? We might say that the Chazal said that on Yom Tov we completely remove the concept of tumas ha'ma'aretz, and therefore ba'aflag abdullah hischal nami. Even if you did not begin to sell the barrel of wine, if an ha'ma'aretz went into a store and and not the barrel that's opened by the owner, he touched another wine, he touched another dough, one that wasn't even being sold, you would argue that if that contact happened on Yom Tov, there is no tumas ha'ma'aretz. Here also, at least the Tanach Rabbi Yehuda will say that after Yom Tov it remains tohara. Kamash Malan, that really there is tuma. It's the chuya in order to give simchas Yom Tov, and therefore only when the vendor was selling the barrel he tiru seifers b'chilasan, and therefore hischel in. But if lo hischel well, now the question is, v'ula my kama, why didn't he say the one of Rachava? So answers the Gemara, because the plukta loikomaida, because this fourth case is only according to the Tanach Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim actually hold that even though on Yom Tov you view the wine, you view the dough as tohara, after Yom Tov with no new contact, we say, listen, I know that on Yom Tov it was touched. Afterwards, you view it as tamei. So therefore, he doesn't want to go into a machlokes. You're telling me that Ula doesn't want to quote a machlekes. Will end with this. Hanach nami, all of the three cases is also the plukta ninu. He's saying it's din based on Beis Hillel. Says the Gemara Yishkoyach Beisham and Beis Hillel Eina Mishnah. We have this many times. We don't view Beisham as to be a real authenticated opinion in halacha. Of course, for the mitzvah of limud haTorah, You make a birchas HaTorah and you only learn the Beis Shammai of a Mishnah, you did the greatest mitzvah. You learned Torah, but he's giving up Sagdin. And now that the Baskol said, Halacha Beis Hillel, we have this many times, we don't even take into account Beis Shammai. So, for example, what happens if someone paskin, there's a machlokes, and even though that the consensus is one opinion, you follow the other opinion. We say, okay, you have a leg to stand on. Not if the only leg to stand on is Beis Shammai. And therefore, Ula Dafka said those three because he's not entering a machlokes in halacha. But look, now that we paskin like Beis Hillel, indeed, these are the three cases where L'Kula Alma we can say that he tiru seifan mishum tchilasam, God willing, to be continued. All right.
Oh. Rabbi, I think your internet kind of paused a few times.
Oh, that's not good. I'm in my house. Oh.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't.
Not here. Stay here.
Because I'm just going to get another coffee. I'm back in Mamish in a minute. All right, this is good, Chevra. Good base. Next stuff is very easy, just saying. Like a lot easier. Okay, let's go. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Yud Beis. We are up to Beitzah Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis. We are 7 lines before the bottom of the Amid. We had in the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis the machlokes regarding taking off shutters, replacing the shutters on Yom Tiv. And we had the way this machlokes is recorded in the Mishnah. And we're going to have something that we had a few daf ago, that we have Rab Shimon ben Elazar, that had a different version of the machlokes of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Again, as we will see, that how the shutters were affixed to the booths with tzir, with the pivots, with one pivot, with 2 pivots, with no pivots, will substantially affect the application or the case where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue. That will be the ending, so to say, of the sugya of Daf Yud Aleph. And Chevra, Daf Yud Beis is a very important daf. It's very simple, but we're learning a foundational rule. Danny, you were looking for the word before called mitoich. The word mitoich, Baruch, means since, but that's a very key word. Since means, in the context of the laws of Yom Tiv, that as we quoted in the beginning of the tractate, that in Parshas Boy, I know we're speaking about Pesach, but it's about all of the holidays. The Torah that says that one may not do work, the Torah says, Kol malacha lo yeyasa bahem, you can't do work on Pesach and Yom Tiv. However, asher ye'achel l'chol nefesh, that which is going to be used for food stuff, right? Hu levado ye'yasa lochem, you can do what you need to do to prepare food on Yom Tiv. So food-related melachos, the word melacha meaning that which normally may not be done on Shabbos and on Yom Tiv, is permitted for Yom Tiv. No one debates that. It's a verse in the Chumash. However, how far do we extend it? So here's basically what's going to be the crux of the matter. Mitoich, Beis Hillel will say, Mitoich shehutra l'tzoyrech, since we are allowed to do a certain activity for food-related purposes, that, so to say, reveals that activity is not that serious when Yom Tiv, as far as Yom Tiv is concerned, and therefore it may be done even for non-food related activities. Beis Shammai doesn't subscribe to this whole principle of mitoich. Now we're going to speak out. This is very important. A three-way argument amongst the Rishonim. Beis Hillel, whom we paskin like, we just learned that Beis Shammai is not even a Mishnah. How far do we say it doesn't have to be for litzoirech? So the most limiting application will be the sheet of Rabbeinu Hananel. There has to be a mitzvah need. I'll give you an example. You're not allowed to transport Shabbos and Yom Tov, Hoitzah, right? The beginning of Masechta Shabbos. But I can take food from my house to your house, from your house to mine. Oichel nefesh, I can violate. So there's no violation of Hoitzah. Hoitzah is chutar. Mitoich, according to Beis Hillel, will only mean that I can transport something for a mitzvah. So if you need a Sefer Torah in a shul, you can carry a Sefer Torah. If you want to carry a baby for the baby to have a bris, you can carry the baby. If it's not mitzvah related, you can't do it even according to Beis Hillel. The other end of the spectrum is Shitas Rashi, and we're going to learn Gemara Rashi. Rashi holds that even if there is no need at all, it's permitted. The in-between opinion, which is that Rabbeinu Tam and many other Rishonim, they say, listen, there has to be some need. It's called there has to be some need for Yom Tov. It doesn't have to be for a mitzvah need, but there has to be stam, you can't do it. Okay, that's going to be the topic on Amud Aleph, with many other details to that. And just a quick finish the intro on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, we're going to have a whole different topic. But we already mentioned it before. Number one rabbinically is not allowed to tithe produce on Shabbos on Yom Tov. Why not? Because you are fixing it. You are rectifying it. Okay, it's not discernible, correct. It's not prohibited midoiraisa. It's not makeba patish midoiraisa, but it's prohibited midorabanan. But coming back to food-related things, foods that you are allowed to make and you made on Yom Tov. For example, you needed a dough. The dough did not exist before Yom Tov. You were unable to separate challah. Now, challah has the status of truma. Everyone agrees that you could and you have to separate the dough on Yom Tov. In the case where you made the dough on Yom Tov. I'll give you another example. When you slaughter a behema, when you slaughter a domesticated animal, which is cattle, which is cows, oxen, calves, and goats and sheep. So there are three parts of the animal: the zroya, the lechayayim, and the keva. The right foreleg, the jaw and the tongue, and the stomach called the keva. They have to be gifted to a kohen. Guys, theoretically, even nowadays, there's reasons why we don't do it. It's not so simple. Now, the separation of these three gifts, we call them the gifts, is something that normally may not be done on Yom Tov if you slaughter the animal prior to Yom Tov, but you can shech an animal on Yom Tov. Same concept. Since you did not have access to these three parts, to the gifts, you could separate it on Yom Tov. No one debates that. Question that we will learn is, when the Chazal said don't separate Trumas or Maasros on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, generally included in that prohibition is to deliver it, whether you separate it or not. Even if you separated it yesterday or 2 days ago, you also have to deliver it. Chazal says don't deliver it now on Shabbos, it's harder, but on Yom Tov, don't deliver it on Yom Tov. Question will be, what about the gifts that you were unable to separate prior, like challah? So we will see there is a machlokes whether you are allowed to deliver them or not. And again, there's going to be a lot of nuances. What happens if, according to those who opine that which you only came into the world on Yom Tov, like challah, you couldn't have separated before, that you could deliver. If you're going to say while you are delivering today's challah, can you already deliver yesterday's challah or not? There's going to be a machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and many different ways of applying that machlokes and much, much more. But the big Daf Yud Beis, the topic that's the most relevant is the mitoich. That's the ground zero, but we're going to start on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. We left off again 7 lines before the bottom of the Amud. Let's quickly come back. The topic here is about removing and replacing shutters on these vendors' stalls that were movable. So it's called a halachic keli, whether you may or may not, machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Says our Gemara. Masnisen Deloy Kehai Tana, that there was another Tana, which is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that had a whole different version of the argument Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, not the way Rabbeinu HaKadosh put it in the Mishnah. What does Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar say? The Tanya of Shimon ben Elazar, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, everyone agrees that you are allowed to remove the shutters on Yom Tov. Wow, everyone agrees to that. The only argument is regarding returning it. The whole reason why we allow you to take it off in the first place is in order for you to have more food available. Simchas Yantif. Once the food is available, that's it. And as we learned in the last year, theoretically, he also would have put a limit on it. But because of hitiru soifan mishum tchilasan, if we would prohibit the final phase, you wouldn't even do the first phase. We want for you to be comfortable doing the first phase. We allow you to do the final phase as well. So first of all, already it's different than our Mishnah. According to his version, everyone allows you to remove it. Now let's go further. When the shutters are attached by pivots, if there are no pivots, which means they were never really affixed. So when you remove it, it's not really called an act of stira, of removing or of dismantling. When you replace it, you're not really building. Then there's b'chlal not an issue mutter. 3 lines before the bottom, but we learned in another Beitzah, that is where there's an argument. But if you have pivots, everyone holds that it's prohibited to replace. And there's a brilliant solution. The brilliant solution is that if there would only be with pivots or without pivots, you got a contradiction. All we need to do is we got to make 3 scenarios. 2 pivots. 2 pivots means, wow, like 2 hinges. It's really affixed. 0 pivots, shvachamaises in Yiddish, and the in-between. Oh, gewaltig. So it says Abaye, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid, like this. If the pivots are on its side, which means it has 2 pivots, each side has a pivot, then divrei hakoil asur, it's prohibited to replace. Guys, you are allowed to remove. Even Beis Hillel will hold you cannot replace. That is explaining that Beitzah, right? B'sheyesh lamtzid divrei hakoil asur. Beis Hillel, you can't replace it because that's really building. If there are no pivots, then everyone agrees that you can replace it. Ki pligi, the argument is b'sheyesh lamtzid be'emsa. There was 1 pivot and daf yud beis on the top. Mar Sover, that's Beishamai, Gozrin on Sir Be'emtza Otzat Sir Benatzad, even though he also theoretically would subscribe that 1 pivot, 1 hinge is not called a proper building. It should be permitted, but if you will allow this, a slippery slope, you'll allow that. Omar Sobar, the way Gozrin on. And now she speaks out, therefore, how you make the Beitzah of Rav Shimon ben Elazar and the other Beitzah mamish work one with the other. And now, with tremendous joy, Chavra, we are starting the sugya, the topic of mitoich, sins, which is huge. Because indeed, we paskin like Beis Hillel, and it's not only that regarding food-related activities, there are many things that we are permitted to do on Yom Tov, which is why we have a standalone Masechtas Yom Tov, which we call now Masechtas Beitzah or Beya, but we apply it even to non-food related. Says the Mishnah, the case of the Mishnah is concerning carrying, transporting. Mamish, like Shabbos begins with transporting, so we introduced the mitoich regarding the general prohibition of transporting, and this case that the topic will be a mitzvah, a hoitzah, transporting something, transferring something for a mitzvah sake, but not food related. You may not carry a minor. We're speaking about carrying a minor, an infant for the bris milah, even though it's a mitzvah. You may not transport the lulav. Nor a sefer Torah, in other words, even though it's a hoitzah, transporting, carrying, mitzvah related, so what? It's not food. Now I want you to know like this, just to appreciate this. If you were to open up the Mishnah by yourself, you could have certainly understood that they are arguing whether transporting is a prohibition on Yom Tov or not. If you remember in the beginning of Shabbos, right, what did we ask? The big question was, why didn't Masechta Shabbos begin on Daf Ayin Gimel? Go through the 39 melachas in the middle of Klal Gadol, the Mishnah. Why did we begin with the prohibition of hoitzah? So Tosfos says, hoitzah is called the malacha gerua. You know, the way we defined a malacha means you are transforming something. When you carry something from one domain to the other, you didn't transform it at all. So one would have argued it's bechlal not called a malacha. And as the Gemara is going to speak out, one might have understood that maybe Beishamai Beis Hillel, no one holds of mitoich. No one says the words mitoich. Maybe Beis Hillel simply holds that there isn't a problem to carry on Yom Tov. to make sure that that's not the way you understand it, there was a teacher of Beitzah that he quoted the following. It says in a Beitzah, that if you slaughter a private donation oila, sacrifice on Yom Tov, you get flogged for breaking Yom Tov. Now hold on. Those sacrifices where the Torah says bimoyadoi, that have to be brought at a specific time, which are the communal karbanos, are allowed to be done, and indeed it's done on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. You bring all of those karbanos. You bring the kamer tamid, you bring the kamer musaf. Private karbanos may not be brought on Shabbos, but what happens if you have a private carbon, but people get to eat from it? The moment you get to eat from it, you can do it on Yom Tov. But a oila, the definition of a carbon oila is a sacrifice that all of it is burnt up. None of it is consumed. So therefore, says the Beitzah, says the Tanach, that if someone shechted, even in a mitzvah context, an oilas, nedava b'Yom Tov, he's going to be chayiv malchus. So Omar Lei says, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, when I hear these words, I know that the author of this Beitzah is following Beis Shammai. The Amr Lachmani, whose opinion does this reflect? Only Beis Shammai. The Amri, they are the ones, and that's the way Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi correctly interpreted our Mishnah, that the machlokes isn't only about, is there a problem with transporting on Yom Tov or not? No, it's a much broader question. Mitoich or no mitoich? That they say that lo yamrina mitoich shehutra hoitzah l'tzoyrech. He's saying the word hoitzah because our Mishnah is speaking about hoitzah. Is hutram shaloi l'tzoyrech. But since Beis Hillel argues with Beis Shammai, and the argument isn't only about hoitzah, it's a much broader concept. Beis Hillel subscribes to mitoich. And just like Beis Hillel says it regarding transporting, hachinami here also, shechting and oila, I know that it's not food related. Shchita will be permitted. And quickly to review, even according to the Rabbeinu Hananel, that has the most limiting application of mitoich, that it has to be l'tzoyrech mitzvah, it fits because shechting a carbon is a mitzvah, it's a tzorech mitzvah. Again, so you have one sheet of Rabbeinu Hananel, you have Rabbeinu Tam here, and other Rishonim that say there has to be some tzorech, and you have Shitas Rashi, the most lenient, that applies mitoich, even if there's no tzorech at all. I do want to just say one beautiful thing, that Rabbi Yosef Engel makes a correlation. This is based on the sheet of most Rishonim, that you can do what otherwise would be called a malacha, if there is some benefit you get on Yom Tov, there's some tzorech to a din in Bava Kama. If you remember in Bava Kama, when we learned the Arba of his Nizikin, so we were learning about Shane, that if an animal with its teeth eats and damages other person's property, how the owner is responsible, and included in Shane is any activity that the animal does for its own benefit. Like if the animal is scratching its back and on your car, on your carriage, and it ruins your carriage, that's included in Shane. So says Rabbi Yosef Engel, what is Shane? Eating. The fact that in Bava Kama, the laws of damages, we correlate anything the animal does for its hana'ah is included in eating and shame. How great is that? So any type of malacha that's done for your tzoyrech, episode tzoyrech, is included in the heter of oichel nefesh, which is shame. Genius. Okay. Maskev lo rabom. This premise that which is going to stand. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi understands that the machlokes of our Mishnah is not a limited machlokes only regarding is there an isur of hoitzah or not. No. It's about mitoich. How do you know? How do you know that? They never said those words. Maybe it's a very limiting argument. It's a very limited, a very narrow argument. It was only regarding Eruv. Eruv is Eruv Chatzeres. The enactment of King Solomon to have to make an Eruv Chatzeres is all based on the prohibition of carrying. No, maybe they're arguing whether the whole problem of Hoitzah, which is the Malach Gerua, which is a novelty, even regarding Shabbos, maybe it doesn't apply by you. That's their argument. That Mar Savar, that's Beis Shammai, Eruv Hoitzah Shabbos, and also Eruv Hoitzah Yom Tov. And since you can't carry, you can't carry. You want to take a minor to his bris milah? I'm sorry, you can't carry. Mar Savar, Eruv Chatzeres Shabbos, maybe that's Beis Hillel. And there is no problem at all with Eruv and Hoitzah Yom Tov. Has nothing to do with Shchita. Maybe Beis Hillel will agree that if you shecht on carbon oil, you're going to be chayiv malchus. Who says it's about mitoich? Now, why would we even argue? Why we have to find some source that the prohibition of carrying does not apply to Yom Tov, but we have such a source. And we find words of admonition of Yirmiyahu where he tells the people, start keeping Shabbos. Stop transporting on Shabbos. He admonished the people. Now, he only admonished them for violating Shabbos. He never spoke about Yom Tov. Now, the counter argument will be is that when Yirmiyahu was speaking to a group of people that were not yet observant, sometimes you can't win it all. So at least don't carry on Shabbos. B'chlal, Shabbos is more strict. The penalty is skila. That would be a way of understanding it. But this is also, on the other hand, it might sound from this verse that he was not admonishing them for carrying on Yom Tov because there's no problem b'chlal. It's only about is hoitzah asur on Yom Tov or not. How do you know that? So this question, that's a classic answer that you are answering with a question. Maskiv la Rabbi Yosef. No, he's asking a Rabbah, which is really answering Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abdimi. Elama'ata, if that would be the case, why do they not argue regarding Avanim? Now we're learning a very important yesod. If people who learn, as we should, the Shulchan Aruch, when you begin Shin Ches, when we begin learning in Shulchan Aruch the laws of Muktzah, the Alter Rebbe brings 3 reasons for why did the Chazal say you made things are Muktzah. And the second one is the concept of Chashash Hoitza'a Noguba. That one of the reasons why things are Muktzah is because Chazal felt that if you're going to end up moving things, you might end up transporting it. Stones is a great example of real Muktzah. It's not even a keli. Linking muktzah to carrying would mean that if there is no prohibition carrying, then there will be no prohibition of muktzah. So if the ganze machlokes is whether this hoitzah on Yom Tov or not, challenges Rabbi Yosef to answer Rabbi Yitzchak against Rabbah, then our Mishnah should have recorded their argument regarding stones. Are stones muktzah or not? And if Beis Hillel is pshat is that there is no isur of hoitzah, then there should not be a muktzah on stones on Yom Tov. He makes no such statement. Ella midoloi mafligi ba'avanim. Just an example. Or in any other muktzah item, shmami no. It's not b'hoitzah shaloi l'tzoyrech pligi. It's about shaloi l'tzoyrech. It's about mitoich or not. It is a broader argument. And furthermore, not only did Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi understand, so Rabbah challenged it. So we're going to find yet another Amayda, the great Rabbi Yechanan, also clearly understands Savar that the topic of our machlokes is the mitoich shehutra l'hoitzah l'tzoyrech hutra nam shaloi l'tzoyrech pligi, and not the limited argument whether there is an isur of hoitzah on Yom Tov or not, allowing us now to take Beis Hillel and to apply it to many other scenarios. Like, for example, according to Beis Hillel, if you shecht an oile in the temple on Yom Tov, you won't be chayiv malchus. You can't eat it. So what? What did you do wrong? Shchita? Shchita is permitted. Why mitoich? Okay. The Tanach Rabbi Yechanan, how do we know that he subscribes to this better, broader understanding of this argument? So here we begin. So you had these Beitzah teachers. They know everything by heart. And he's reviewing by heart. And this is what he's quoting. If a person, God forbid, cooks the gid hanashim, the sciatic nerve, in milk on Yom Tov, and he'll eat it, then he's going to be chayiv 5 times malchus. So let's get to the 5 times malchus. So number one, like a mishum avashal gid, because he cooked a gid hanashim. Now hold on. On Yom Tov, you can only cook l'tzoyrech echol nefesh. One is not allowed to eat a gid, right? There's no tzorech achila. So therefore, you're violating cooking a gid. Number 2, you're going to get malchus for eating the gid. Number 3, mishum mebashal basar b'chalav. Now I know in Chulin we're going to go through this whole details. We have a machlokes whether the gid, whether the sinew, the sciatic nerve has a status of meat or not. It doesn't have a taste. Obviously, this Tana subscribes to gid being qualified as meat. That's why you violated for cooking meat and milk. And you're going to get malchus for eating basar b'chalav and the loika daf yud beis amud beis for havara. No, it's you kindled the fire on Yom Tov completely unnecessarily because you're not allowed to eat it. So quoted this genius, the memory genius. Amalei says Rabbi Yechanan to this Tana teacher, Puk Tana Labara. That's the classical example. There's Beitzah corrupted. Go outside and teach it. Oh, don't come and teach it to me. And I'll tell you why. Because Havara ubishul ein lamish. It can't be that there is an issue of kindling or cooking, since kindling and cooking are malachas that are permitted for food, for kosher foods. So therefore, we paskin like Beis Hillel, and obviously, clearly, Rabbi Yechanan understands that the question in our Mishnah is not about only hoitzah; it's about all of the malachas. Any malacha that is allowed l'tzorech chochel nefesh is allowed shaloi l'tzorech chochel nefesh. So therefore, there won't be any problem with havana. And then he goes further. The Im Tim Solaim Rabbi Yechanan tells him, well, you can say that Mishnah, it is a Mishnah, but who's the author of this Beitzah? Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai the Amri lo yamrin and itech shut lohitzah l'tzorech. And therefore, because like we spoke out the Beis Hillel, given the Amri Mitech Shut Beis Hillel, Hachinami Beis Hillel will hold Mitech Shut Hutra Nami Shaloy. So he's telling him that if it's not corrupted, it's only following Beis Shammai. Also go teach it outside because ain't a Mishnah. Or you can teach it inside, but let's make it clear it's Beis Shammai. Clearly, Rabbi Yechanan understands that our Mishnah is not limited to whether you can transport, carry on Yom Tov or not. No, it's much broader. And indeed, so we paskin, we reject Rabbah, and because of that, there are indeed many activities that one is allowed to do on Yom Tov, all beginning from the Achashel Ye'achel L'chol Nefesh Hu Levadoi. The Levadoi is not such a Levadoi because of the principle of Mitoich. And this machlokes that we quoted, Rabbeinu Hanan, Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi, is very relevant to halacha l'maisa. How far do we extend certain activities, even though it's not food related? Beautiful. Okay. Second topic of today. Let's see how far we'll get. We spoke this out in the introduction. Quickly repeating it. Number one, there is a rabbinic prohibition to separate trumas or maisras, tithings, including challah, including the matanas, on Yom Tov. However, something that you only made on Yom Tov, permissibly, like kneading a dough, like slaughtering an animal, you had no option of removing the challah prior. It did not exist prior. Now, I want you to know when it comes to the matanos, it's not like before you take off the zroya, the lechoyayim, and the keva, the right foreleg and the jaw with the tongue, and the stomach called the keva. It's not that you can't eat any other part of the animal. No, it's not tevel. But when you're eating from an animal, there will come a point that you'll be coming so near the jaw or so near the tongue that you'll have to remove it. And you could remove it. No one debates that. But we have to be aware that included in the general prohibition of separating tithings on Shabbos and on Yom Tov is also the prohibition of delivering it. And when I say delivering it, it's not only about you bringing it to the kohen, it's also about the kohen coming to pick it up from you. That is something that's generally prohibited. No one debates that. So this is the premise of now appreciating the machlokes. So what is subject to an argument? Beis Shammai yoimrim, ein moilichin chalo matanis l'kohen b'Yom Tov. You may not deliver. The prohibition stands. You may not deliver challah. You may not deliver what we call the gifts. Zroya, l'chayayim, and the keva to a kohen on Yom Tov. Being shehurbu me'emesh. Not only if you already made the dough yesterday, you separated the challah yesterday, you could have delivered it yesterday, but you didn't. Not only when you slaughtered the animal yesterday again, so you could have separated the matanos. The chiddush of Beis Shammai is being shehurbu me'hayoim. Even if you only separated them today, which you were allowed to do, so you would have thought, oh, if you separated it today, you can deliver it today. Says Beis Shammai, no, you can separate it, but you still may not deliver it. However, Beis Hillel hold Matilde, that you are allowed to deliver it. In other words, here's very important. Beis Hillel allows you to deliver it not only, more in the Gemara, but just not only if you separated it today, but even if you separated it yesterday. Since if you would have made the dough today, you would be allowed to separate it. And therefore, Beis Hillel understands the takanas chachamim for you not delivering it doesn't apply. Even if de facto you did it yesterday, you still may deliver it. Good. Now back and forth. Amalahem Beis Shammai. Shammai challenges Beis Hillel. Gzeira Shava. This is not your classical Gezeira Shava. It's a Shem Hamushal. It's a borrowed term. Gezeira Shava means that l'chayda we should compare challah and matanos. which are included in the 24 gifts to a kohen, they are matana l'kohen. Why don't we should compare it to truma? Truma may never be delivered, and I'll tell you why. Because truma may never be separated on Yom Tov. This statement will be challenged in the Gemara, but based on the premise that truma may never be separated on Yom Tov, so therefore it may never be delivered. Truma is a matana l'kohen. So therefore, kshem she'ein melichin es truma on Yom Tov. So Beishamai says to make everything the same as we should, consistent. Kach ein melichin es matanos. Even if you did separate the challah because you were allowed, but this law of not delivering should stand. Amru lehem beisilul, no, we don't compare them because they're not similar. Im amartem betruma, indeed she'enoi zakai baharamasa, because one has no right to separate trumas and Yom Tov. Again, we might find an exception, but that's the rule. That since shezakoy baharamasan, in the case where you make the dough on Yom Tov, in the case where you slaughter the animal on Yom Tov, so logic says you may deliver it. And let's extend it. Since you may deliver that which was separated today, you may either deliver that which was separated yesterday. That's how we're learning the Mishnah. So that's the back and forth. Now, Kosal Kadaiton, that whenever the Mishnah said, Shuhurmu Mahayoim, when the Mishnah is referring to gifts that were separated today, it's referring to a case where the animal was only slaughtered today. And by the way, everything we're learning now regarding the gifts, the same goes to challah. The Mishnah, the Gemara just doesn't want to mention both cases the whole time. So the Havamina is that whenever the Mishnah speaks about that which was separated today, is only referring to that which was slaughtered today. Whenever the Mishnah speaks about that which was separated yesterday, is referring to that which was even slaughtered yesterday. If that will be the understanding of the Mishnah, there's a big chiddush here on the side of Beishamai. It's going to come out that Beishamai prohibits delivering even that which could not have been separated yesterday. You only made the shechita today. Still, Beishamai says not to deliver it. Never. If that will be pshat in the Mishnah, then I want you to know, says the Gemara, that our Mishnah cannot follow Rabbi Yossi, it cannot follow Rabbi Yehuda, it can only follow Acherim. And what we will have now is very simple Gemara. We're going to have a Beitzah with all of these three Tanoim. Each one has another version of where they argued. And the way we just learned the Mishnah, then it must be Acherim. So let's go. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, no one argues regarding the gifts. That what, even though you separated these gifts yesterday, if you also made a dough today, if you also shechted an animal today, according to Rabbi Yehuda, everyone agrees that not only could you deliver that which you were unable yesterday, once you are already making a delivery, you can add to it that which you could have done yesterday. And or wow, clear, not Beishamai. It's like it's so lenient. Where is their argument? He limits it. If something was separated pre-Yom Tov, only that case, only pre-Yom Tov gifts, only pre-Yom Tov challah, could you deliver it or not? That is where Beishamai is machmir. They say ein moilichin, and Misilul says moilichin. Our Mishnah clearly let Rabbi Yehuda. And but let's go on. Everyone had the back and forth. The kachoy Beishamai danin challah umatonis is a matana l'koyin. Truma is a matana l'koyin. And kshem she'ein molichin es truma kach en molichin es matonis. To which Amalem Beisilel loy im amartem betruma, since like we had in our Mishnah she'ein zakoy baharamasa, there's no right to separate it on Yom Tov. Since matanes are allowed to be separated on Yom Tov, holds Beisilel, even though according to Rabbi Yehuda he's speaking about matanes that were separated yesterday, doesn't matter. You could deliver it because the takanas chachamim not to deliver is an extension of their takana not to separate. Any type of separation that theoretically could have been done today could be delivered today, even though this one was done yesterday. Amar Rabbi Yossi, he disagrees. And again, our Mishnah, based on the Kosalka Daitoch, will also not be the way Rabbi Yossi understands the argument. How does Rabbi Yossi understand the argument? All gifts, even pre-Yom Tov gifts, even Beishamai holds you can deliver it. Wow, he's the most lenient. By itself, wow. The only argument is Truma. Beis Shammai holds ein moilichen, you may never deliver truma on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel oimrim, again, this is not like our Mishnah. No, it's all new Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel doesn't subscribe to any prohibition of delivering even truma. Moilichen. And v'kach hoyu Beis Hillel done, and now Beis Hillel were the ones that made this, so to say, gzeira shava b'shem hamushal. They said chalo matanos is one of the 24 gifts to a kohen. It's called matana l'kohen. Truma is a matana l'kohen. Kshem shemavs matanos, the matanos chalo and the gifts both can be delivered no matter when, even if they only were preemptive, even if that's the only ones you have. Kach melichin as truma. Truma is learned from chalo matanos. Since shezakoi baharomasan, you have the right to separate them on Yom Tov. That's why Beis Shammai agrees, according to Rabbi Yossi, even if the only thing you have is that which was separated prior to Yom Tov, it could be delivered. Talking about truma, that there isn't truma that can be separated on Yom Tov. Again, not our Mishnah, but yes, based on the Kosalka Daitach, at least it will fit with Achedim. Achedim oimrim, that's the third version in the argument. Beis Shammai Beis Hillel al truma she'ein truma for sure may never be delivered. And now let's get into how they argue. Beis Shammai oimrim may never deliver. Beis Hillel oimrim that you may deliver. In other words, when Beis Shammai says, according to Achedim, that you may never deliver, he doesn't specify any difference. Beis Shammai across the board says you may never deliver. Mashman, the way we understand, not only may you not deliver something that was already pre-separated prior to Yom Tov, Beis Shammai says you can't even deliver that which was separated on Yom Tov. So it definitely fits like Achedim. Well, it's not ideal because, so Lema, it's only Achedim and not Rabbi Yehuda. It goes without saying not Rabbi Yossi, but also not Rabbi Yossi. Says Rabbi no. I mean, the Kosalka Baitach, I won't accept the premise. Does it say in our Mishnah that Beis Shammai prohibits Shehurmu Mahayoim v'Nishchatu Mahayoim? He never says that. He never says that. Maybe Shehurmu Ketani U'La'olam Shchitasaim Me'emesh, that the case of our Mishnah in which Beis Shammai is a machmer is only because it was slaughtered yesterday, and therefore it could have been separated and delivered yesterday. Only there is Beis Shammai machmer, but maybe, like Rabbi Yehuda learns, even according to Beis Shammai, if something only came to being today on Yom Tov, and you may separate it, you also may deliver it. Well, if that will be the pshat, later that our Mishnah is taka only Rabbi Yehuda and not Achedim. Says the Gemara, not. No. That afilu teima Achedim. However, ubahanoch the nishchatu emesh, the Mishnah is only speaking about matanos that were slaughtered. I'm sorry, Achedim only was speaking about matanos that were able to be transported yesterday, which basically means that's the problem, that Achedim and Rabbi Yehuda are saying the same thing. Affecting Gemara, Ihachi, there's our Mishnah can be both Achedim and Rabbi Yehuda. So then Achedim and Rabbi Yehuda are saying the same thing. Says the Gemara, no. Ikebenayu Tefilla. Tefilla means that what happens if, now that we establish something, even Beis Shammai, something that was slaughtered today could be gifted and delivered today. The whole machlokes is something that was slaughtered yesterday. Oh, what happens if you also have something that you slaughtered today and which may be delivered? Now the question is, will Beis Shammai at least be lenient by saying that since you can deliver that which came today as an accompaniment, can you also deliver that which was done yesterday? Here is where Rabbi Yehuda is mekel. Here is where Achedim are machmer, and our Mishnah is not mentioning it because our Mishnah is not speaking about such a case. Bottom line is, not Rabbi Yossi, but at least it can be also according to Rabbi Yehuda. Let's move on. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda. Yes, let's go.
A quick general question on this whole delivery business. What's the inherent problem that we have bringing the gift to the kohen on Yom Tov? So what are we afraid? Is it because of carrying?
No. We don't want you to separate Trumas U'Maasros on Shabbos and on Yom Tov.
Right.
Included in that prohibition was don't deliver it.
But why is it better if it's the day of versus the day before?
Because since on the day of, challah and matanos are allowed to be separated, that's why there's a logic to say the whole delivery is prohibited as an extension of the prohibition on separating. That which you could separate, says Beis Hillel, you can deliver. And the way we just concluded, it's not even, it's more than that. even something that you separated yesterday. Since if you were to make a dough, you can separate and deliver the challah today. So Beis Hillel says, as far as challah is concerned, there is no problem with delivering. And Beis Shammai disagrees with that. That's how we just learned. Beis Shammai is moida that if you would have slaughtered it today, and therefore you separated the matonis today, you can deliver it today. But something which could have been done before is included in the general prohibition of not delivering on Yom Tov. Okay, right. Omar, Danny, delivering even if there's no haitzah. Don't forget that Beis Shammai doesn't allow you to transport. Right?
Even if the separating was,
food items.
But even if the separating was done yesterday, so what are we worried about? Just delivering.
Doesn't matter. Once the Chazal said don't separate, don't deliver, so it stands. Correct. That's normal. I want you to know that now that we have this Beitzah and we mamish limited the argument by Truma, that we paskin like Rabbi Yossi, which is amazing. Which means that according to Rabbi Yossi, even Truma, which may not be separated, that's what you're saying, Danny. Delivering is a different thing. You can deliver it. Okay. Says the Gemara, Rab Toivi, the son of Rab Nechemya, Havalei Garba, the Chamra, the Truma. He had a jug of wine that was Truma. And also come to Rabbi Yosef. And he wanted to know, we paskin like Beis Hillel. We just don't know what Beis Hillel said. So can I follow Rabbi Yossi's Beis Hillel? Amtuye means to bring it, to deliver it to a kohen. Now is on Yom Tiv. Amalei, yeah, you can do that. That's so we paskin. Amalei, hachem Rabbi Shmuel. Yes, halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. Weiter. Ush bezichnei, the host of Rava bar Rav Chanan. Havalei isuri yasa the chardla. He had bundles of mustard stalks. Now, what's the issue? Amalei, he asked him, Mahu leferuchei umechal minayu b'yamtiv. Can I crumble the pods to remove the seeds to eat it on Yom Tov? Oichel nefesh, food-related activities are allowed to be done only from a certain point on, like we mentioned. If it's from the point where if you would have done it before Yom Tov, it would have been less fresh, that is what you are allowed to do it on Yom Tov. Threshing, dash, and removing the mustard seeds from their stalks is included in the general prohibition of dash. Threshing should be prohibited on Yom Tov. On the other hand, it's it's like shchita because you're eating it right away. You're not going to be taking the mustard seeds and do what you normally do is to make it into mustard. No, you're going to be eating them right away. So maybe that's allowed. Is it allowed or not? Rabbi Bar Chanan didn't know. When you don't know, you say, I don't know. What did he do? He helped him. Either the Ushbezichne went or Rabbi Bar Chanan went. And Amalei quoted the Beitzah that yes, moilelin mililos, we are allowed to rub ears of grain to eat the grains. Similarly, umefarchen kitniyos, you can crumble legumes. That's something that is allowed. Now, why is it allowed? It's dash. So what you need, that Rashi adds, it's allowed because it's called doing a melacha kila achar yad or doing a melacha shaloi kedarkei. Since this is not the usual way, anything, my friends, that's a rule that is only generally something that's prohibited only rabbinically on Shabbos is completely permitted on Yom Tov. So a melacha that's done kila achar yad on Yom Tov is lechatchila mutar. Remember this rule. Let's go back into the Gemara. Okay. Eisvei Abaya. Now that Abaya hears this rule of Rava, it says, Hamoilo melilois me'elef Shabbos. If a person already with his hands, they rub the ears of grain. So you have grain with the shaft. You did not yet separating on Shabbos. Separating is problematic. We're speaking about Shabbos. So the next day, tomorrow on Shabbos, you can throw it from one hand to the other. That's a indirect way of separating the kernels from the shaft, and you are allowed to eat it. So using your hands is permitted. separating the chaff from the kernels, even in an unusual way, but using a keli, and that will be using a funnel, using a large plate. When you put any food item on a large plate, if the not good part is light, doesn't weigh as much, so then you simply tilt the plate. What rolls first, that which weighs more, that will be a primitive or a kila'achayad, an unusual way of separation. Even though it's unusual, you may not do it on Shabbos. However, on Yom Tov, like we mentioned, if you rub the ears before Yom Tov, and you should have already separated the shaft, but you didn't, now it's Yom Tov, not only L'macher on Yom Tov are you allowed, can you throw it from one hand to the other, thus getting rid of the shaft? Not only is that allowed, but since it's Yom Tov, you may even use utensils that were not made to sift. They were not made to separate, but you're making use of it, that's also allowed. But what may you not use? You can't use a proper board, which would be a keli that is used for such an activity, nor with a fine sieve, nor with a coarse sieve, that may not be used. Why? So it's food related. So Rashi explains, because since these utensils are normally used to get ready to do boited to a large amount of kernels, a large amount for more than what you need on Yom Tov, it looks like you're doing something on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov. That's the problem. Now, says, all of this is the kasha of Abaya. What do we infer from this Beitzah? That's only me'erev Yom Tov. The Beitzah is only addressing, what do we do now that you already rubbed the ears before Yom Tov? How do you completely get rid of the shaft? Which means, it can only be done on Erev Yom Tov, but on Yom Tov you may not rub it to take the kernels out of the shaft. Says the Gemara, Yom Tov. But since we are comparing Yom Tov to Shabbos, on Shabbos you for sure may not do it, so either the Tanim Erev Shabbos, Tanim Sefer Nami, Erev Yom Tov. Why are we bringing all this in over here? How is it related to our Mishnah? It's hugely related to the Mishnah, because the premise of our version in the Mishnah is, Beishamai, who's the machmer, is comparing challah and matanos to truma, and the Silul's counter is, no, don't compare truma, because truma may never be separated on Yom Tov. So therefore, truma may never be delivered. Challah and matanos, in the case that it only came into being on Yom Tov, for sure may be separated on Yom Tov. Now we have a problem. If you are permitting on Yom Tov for you to remove the kernels from the shaft, so it should be this. Now you should be allowed to separate truma. Why can you separate challah on Yom Tov? Because if God is allowing me to make a dough, and the whole obligation of challah is only from when I have a dough, then it has to be that I can separate challah. God allows me to shecht an animal, then the gifting of the matanis, or at least the separating of the matanis, can only be done after you shecht. Same thing over here, second to last line. Based on all of this, now that we established that you are allowed to rub ears on Yom Tov, okay, because don't forget, my friends, that truma, the obligation of truma is only when the item is a finished product. You can never separate truma when the kernels are in the shaft. The obligation should only begin from when you have the kernels separated from the shaft. If we found a permissible way of creating kernels, so to say, bringing forth kernels that are now edible, now you should be mechuyev to separate the truma. And v'hatanan, we learned in our Mishnah, that's the whole connection, that loy, Beisilol tells Beishamai, im amartem betruma, truma is different. Truma may never be delivered because truma may never be separated. Now I found a case where you could separate, where you are allowed to separate truma on Yom Tov in this case. So the Gemara says, no, like Hashem. Like Hashem means everyone agrees that you are allowed to rub the ears of grain on Yom Tov. You are allowed to extract the kernels. Who says you have to separate truma? And that is actually our subject, a machlokes between Tanoim. So Rabbi Yosi ben Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Taka holds that there is a scenario where one may separate trumas on Yom Tov. Rabbi holds that when you rub the ears and you took out some kernels, now you classify the kernels that they are a ready product. Any ready product has to be tithed. If it only became ready on Yom Tov, then you have to tithe it on Yom Tov, and you are allowed to tithe it on Yom Tov. However, our Mishnah Beis Hillel is following what we call the sheet of Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda that holds that even though you, for a snack, you're going to rub the shaft and you're going to take out some kernels, and you can do it, no problem. It's not called a ready product. If it's not called a ready product, there isn't a biblical obligation to tithe it. The rabbis are not going to say you have to tithe it because it's Yom Tov, and the rule is you can't tithe on Yom Tov. Where do we find this argument? Clearly, the Tanya. Hichnis shibolim lasos memisa. Normally, shibolim are ears of grain. The obligation to tithe is only after you separated the kernels from the chaff, after you winnowed it, really normally after you place it into a pile and you smooth the pile. Now, if you brought the shibolim into your house, because you will only in your house separate it from the chaff and make a dough, so says the Beitzah that oichel mehem aray upater. There isn't a biblical obligation yet. There isn't a biblical obligation yet to separate trumas from maasros. If there would have been a biblical obligation because you brought it into your house, then you would not even be allowed to snack from it. It's not called a finished product, and therefore, taka on a rabbinic level, you can't make a proper meal. But even aray, if you're having a snack, you can have a snack even before you separated trumas. Why? Because shibolim is not called a finished product. There was no chiyuv b'chlal to tithe it. However, what happened? That's if you brought it into your house to make a dough out of it. But if you brought it into your house, if you brought it into your house, you're not making a dough out of it. You enjoy snacking on kernels. So if you brought it into the house to take out these kernels, then we view the shibolim and its entry, re'iyas pnei abayis, now you're obligated. That's gavaldik. And therefore, like we just explained, since according to Rebbe, when you bring in melilos in your house, you're chayv to separate trumos, and you can't separate trumos when it's still in the shaft. Now that we said l'kula alma, you are allowed to remove by rubbing these ears, and you can remove the kernels. You're mechuyev to separate trumos biblically, and therefore you taka are allowed to separate truma in this case on Yom Tov. However, the Beis Hillel holds that you're still pater. In other words, that we don't, even though that you plan to eat the kernels, it's not called a finished product. On a biblical level, there is b'chlal no obligation to separate truma, and therefore, coming back to Hilchas Yom Tov, it's correct what Beis Hillel says. There is never a scenario where the obligation comes into being is chal on Yom Tov, and therefore you may never separate trumas on Yom Tov. God willing, to be continued. Beautiful.
Question on, can you hear me?
Yeah,
question
on,
if you have a malacha, you said on Yom Tov it could be done, but kelachar yad, is that for any malacha or?
Yes, that's a good rule. There are exceptions, but the rule is that which is prohibited rabbinically on Shabbos, in many cases, is permitted on Yom Tov. Yeah.
Can you give an exception?
I'll give you just another example. Passing fire from one place to the other. No, I take that back. Can I give another? Can I give an exception to this rule?
Just to be clear, Kevan, it's also midrabanan on Shabbos to do something klachar yad.
Oh yeah.
No, I understand that. But we're saying on Yom Tov, it's not us. It's allowed.
Right.
Right. No, I'm just saying. I was asking for an exception on Yom Tov that you cannot do with kelachar yad. Anyway, if you come,
I'm going to think it'll come to me. You're speaking about a rabbinic.
Right.